everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing tissues. Tissues are groups or layers of cells that work together to perform a common function. There are four main types of tissue in the human body. Epithelial tissue functions to cover body surfaces and line hollow organs. Epithelial tissue also lines body cavities and forms ducts and glands. Connective tissue functions to protect and support the body. Connective tissue binds organs, stores energy, and provides space for the immune system. Muscular tissue functions to contract and generate force. And nervous system functions to communicate in the body. The nervous system detects changes within the body and sends signals to respond. We're going to be discussing epithelial and connective tissue extensively in this chapter. We will touch on muscular and nervous tissue, but there are chapters later in the course that we will spend looking in greater detail at those two types of tissues. Let's compare epithelial versus connective tissue. Epithelial tissue functions to cover the body and line hollow organs, line body cavities, and it makes up ducts and glands. Connective tissue functions to protect and support, bind organs, store energy and nutrients, help with transport in the body, and provide immunity. On the left is epithelial tissue. You can see that there are lots of cells all smushed up next to one another. Since these cells form the linings and the coverings of the body, they are often damaged and need to be repaired and replenished, so epithelial cells divide rapidly. Epithelial tissue often has a poor blood supply, which is called being avascular. In contrast, connective tissue is much looser, with fewer cells and a lot more extracellular space. Connective tissue has an excellent blood supply. Since it is the underlying support and binding of the body, it is usually covered by another tissue, usually epithelium. Connective tissue is very diverse. It has lots of different functions and structures. Let's look at the anatomy of epithelial tissue next. Epithelial cells cover the body and line the hollow organs. The cells are arranged in sheets. You can see in this drawing that the epithelial cells are all standing up next to one another, like a little row of soldiers. Underneath the epithelial tissue is a basement membrane that anchors the cells down onto the underlying tissue. Under the basement membrane is the connective tissue. You can see here that we have names for the different sides of the epithelial cell. The apical surface is the free surface of the cell, the one that is either facing the space outside the body or facing the space inside a hollow organ or cavity. The lateral surface is the side of the cell, and the basal surface is the bottom of the cell, which is attached to the basement membrane. The basement membrane is made up of two layers. The more superficial layer is the basal lamina. It is secreted by the epithelial cells on top of it, and the proteins in this layer attach to the hemidesmosomes to anchor the epithelial cell to the basement membrane. The deeper layer is the reticular lamina. It is secreted by the connective tissue cells underneath called fibroblasts. It is primarily made up of the protein collagen. But what holds these epithelial cells together? There are 5 different types of intercellular junctions. Intercellular means between two cells. The first type is called a tight junction. And this is when the membranes of two adjacent cells get fused together in multiple places. This allows these two cells to form a waterproof barrier. Normally, fluids can seep between two cells, but with tight junctions, it blocks the ability for anything to go between the two cells and essentially waterproofs the lining. You would find this in places where you don't want fluid leaking out, such as blood vessels or in the linings of cavities. Adherens junctions is our second type of intercellular junction. This is when proteins from one cell membrane interact with the proteins from another cell membrane. They come together and interact kind of like Velcro. This makes a very strong adhesion between the two cells. However, it's not waterproof like you would find with a tight junction. These resist separation, and you would find adherens junctions in places like the digestive tract. A desmosome is our third type of intracellular junction. These form spot welds between two cells that help to maintain the structural integrity and resist shearing forces, which is when one cell is being pulled in one direction and another cell is being pulled in another direction. You would find desmosomes in the epidermis, in the bladder, and in cardiac muscle cells. A hemidesmosome is like half a desmosome. You would find this on the basal surface of epithelial cells. These help to anchor the epithelial cell to the underlying basement membrane. The last type of intracellular junction is a gap junction, and this is when proteins form hollow tubes between the membranes of two cells. This allows information to pass very quickly from one cell to another, kind of like a little tunnel. This allows for very rapid communication between two cells. You would find gap junctions in places like cardiac muscle cells and in neurons. Let's now discuss how we name epithelial cells. Epithelial cells are arranged in continuous sheets. We name them based on the shape of the cells and the number of layers of cells in the sheet. If there is only one layer, we call it simple. If there are multiple layers, we call it stratified. You can see here, this is a simple arrangement because there's one layer. This is a stratified arrangement because there are multiple layers of cells. We also name epithelial tissue based on the shape of the cells. Cells can either be squamous, which are thin and flat, cuboidal, which are as wide as they are tall, or columnar, which are tall and thin. So in the case of this particular tissue, we have cuboidal cells that are multiple layers, so we would call this tissue stratified cuboidal. The tissue underneath it is tall and thin, and there's only one layer, so this would be simple columnar epithelium. Some epithelial tissues are transitional. This means they don't really obey these rules. The cell shape can change depending on what's happening to the tissue. We'll talk about this more in a few slides. In some places in the body, the epithelium is keratinized, which means it produces a protein called keratin that helps it resist the escape of moisture. It waterproofs the tissue. Other tissues are ciliated. They have cilia on the apical surface to help move fluids or objects along the surface of the tissue. Remember when we're naming epithelial tissues that cells are named for the shape they are at the apical surface. It helps to remember that the structure informs the function. What this means is that a very thin tissue that is one cell layer thick is not going to be very well suited for protection. It's much too delicate. But that same thin one cell layer thick tissue is very well suited to function for diffusion of nutrients or gases. A tissue that contains flat, very thin cells that are one layer thick is called simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous epithelium functions in diffusion and osmosis. An example of where you'd find this tissue would be lining the inside of the small intestine or lining the blood vessels. Simple cuboidal epithelium, one layer thick, and the cells are as wide as they are tall. These cells function in absorption and secretion. You would find them lining the kidney tubules. Simple columnar epithelium function in absorption and secretion as well as protection. Oftentimes, simple columnar epithelium often contain goblet cells, cells that make and secrete mucus. You can see a goblet cell right here with mucus inside. You would find simple columnar epithelium in the digestive tract, the uterus, and the lining of the intestines. Ciliated simple columnar epithelium is columnar epithelium that has cilia. You can see the cilia up here sticking up off of the apical surface of the cells. This type of epithelium is also often associated with goblet cells. And in addition to absorption and secretion, ciliated simple columnar epithelium is also associated with movement. Ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium is epithelium that looks like it's stratified, but it's not really. If you look at each of these cells, even though there looks to be two layers of nuclei, they all attach to the basement membrane. So we call them pseudo-stratified because they're kind of fake stratified. This type of epithelium is also associated with goblet cells. You would find ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium in the trachea and other areas in the respiratory tract. Moving on to stratified types of epithelium. The first one is stratified squamous epithelium. Epithelial tissue is named for the shape of the cells at the apical surface. You can see down at the basal surface down here, the cells are quite square. But at the very top, they're very, very, very thin. So they would be designated as squamous cells because they are thin and flat. And it's stratified because there are multiple layers. The function of stratified squamous epithelium is protection. In the case of the skin, stratified squamous epithelium also helps to waterproof the body. You can see the difference between this picture up here does not contain keratin, and the picture down at the bottom does contain keratin. So in the vagina, stratified squamous epithelium only provides protection. In the skin, stratified squamous epithelium provides both protection and waterproofing. Stratified cuboidal epithelium is when you have more than one layer of cuboidal cells. The function of this type of epithelium is secretion and protection. An example for where you would find this would be in the testes or in the esophagus. Stratified columnar epithelium is when you have two layers of columnar cells. The function of this type of tissue is secretion and protection, and you would find this, an example of where you would find this would be in the pharynx, behind the oral cavity. Transitional epithelium is that weird one where it's hard to tell what's going on with the cells. You would find this in the urinary bladder, and the urinary bladder changes whether it's relaxed or distended. In a relaxed urinary bladder, the cells are much more tightly packed. But when the bladder gets distended, the cells all pull apart. Their shapes change. The function of transitional epithelium is to provide a certain amount of stretch to the lining of this organ. And you would find it in the urinary bladder and the ureters. The function of glandular epithelium is to secrete product. The product could be sweat or digestive juices, milk or hormones, and we can classify glandular epithelium as either being endocrine or exocrine glands. An endocrine gland is when the cells secrete directly into the bloodstream. An exocrine gland is when the cells secrete into a duct that leads to an outside surface of the body or to the lumen of a hollow organ. On the top, you can see what endocrine glands look like. They surround blood vessels and secrete directly into the blood vessel. Exocrine glands have the cells surrounding the lumen of a duct. We can classify glandular epithelium not only by where the product is released, but also by how it's made. What is being released? Fluid from within the cell, a portion of the cell, or the entire cell? The first classification is called merocrine. And this is when we release fluid via exocytosis. So product is created within the cell and then released from the cell. Examples of merocrine glands would be your salivary glands or your sweat glands. Apocrine glands release part of the cell itself along with the fluid. Examples of apocrine glands would be mammary glands or ceruminous glands. This secretion tends to be thicker because it's not just fluid produced by the cell, but it's the actual cell components itself that are being released. A holocrine secretion is when the entire cell gets released along with all of its contents. An example of this would be sebaceous glands. This type of secretion tends to be the thickest because you have an entire cell that's being released. Go ahead and put your video on pause and try to answer these review questions. Here's your answers. That's it for today. See you in class.